Good morning. I'm Molly Phelps, community organizer here at St. Francis Episcopal Parish and Community Center. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? These are the words that St. Francis has chosen to represent its mission. And I found myself in deep reflection about what this actually means for us in practice. I'm particularly interested in what it means to do justice today, the meaning of which has changed for me significantly over time. To bring everyone along on that discovery with me, I spent more time than I intended in the last few days exploring the different words for justice that show up in the Bible, their etymology, and what that might mean for us in the present moment, but I'll leave that for another time. It's also worth noting how we are called to do justice as an action that we must take and not a state of being or something that will be fully achieved in our lifetimes. It's an ongoing project that is committed to and requires constant evaluation and reevaluation. This, I think, is really key to framing any discussion that we might have about justice. In our current cultural moment in the United States, we define justice in different ways. Some will say that justice means that a person gets what they deserve, whether this is in the context of uplifting people to a place of equity and having what they historically have or have not, or conversely, in the context of punishing someone for doing what we define as a society to be wrong. This is an interesting juxtaposition. Let us next consider some questions. Does doing justice mean that we're working towards liberation for the oppressed? Does it mean that we must provide things to others that they lack? Does it mean dismantling the systems of oppression and harm in our society and building something new? Does it simply mean mitigating the harms that we can? Does doing justice mean that those who have done harm are to get what they deserve and be punished for what they have done? Does it mean that people who do harm are bad people? Does it mean that we have to reevaluate what good and bad mean? Does it mean that we have to find a way to move beyond punishment and move towards restoration and healing from the traumas of oppression, racism, and white body supremacy? We exist in a culture where we respond to harm and violence through punishment, and those who are already oppressed and have little power are disproportionately impacted by these punitive measures. Our current systems do not have the structure to be able to manage harm in a way that allows for the recognition of a person as a product of a larger oppressive system and creates space for the most vulnerable and marginalized to be further exploited, oppressed, and harmed by the ways that we have elected as a culture to be the correct way of dealing with someone who does wrong. For further context here, I'd like us to return to Amy's spiritual sustenance from this last Wednesday, February 16th. She shared with us a passage from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's sermon, Loving Your Enemies. Dr. King shared how learning to love our enemies begins at home, within ourselves. We are tasked with looking inward and examining our own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We heard about how we're called to find the good in another person, how good and bad exist in each of our hearts, and how we must recognize that those opposing parts within us are inherent to our humanness. We were also challenged by the call to not strike down our enemies when we finally have the chance to do so, because they too are caught up in the same systems, even if they might be the ones who have historically held the power and done everything in their control to prevent others from having it. That's easier said than done, right? How can we even imagine a world where injustice looks like extending a hand to those who have done harm? And I think most importantly to my point today, what if we are the ones that have played a part, small or large, in perpetuating and doing that harm? There are ways that I think we can embody the practice in everyday life in small ways with conflict and harm that can prepare us to think about ways to engage in a kind of restorative, reparative, transformative justice around larger harms like violence and oppression, especially when we are the ones who are perpetuating that harm, whether it's intentional or not. The work of accepting that we can, have, and will do harm in general, and harm that perpetuates oppression and violence against marginalized and vulnerable people, begins with the ability to be able to build the resiliency necessary to look within ourselves, recognize the truth that doing harm is inevitable, making peace with it, holding ourselves accountable to our actions, and repairing harm in ways that doesn't perpetuate further harm. The good news here is that we have an opportunity to break generational cycles of harm and violence by making a conscious decision to move beyond revenge or escalation and focus instead on de-escalation and reparation. This process has to start within the self, but also requires the support of the community. Communities share in the culpability when harm happens because there is a culture that says that there will not be an intervention, or that what is happening is okay or normalized, or that harm won't be addressed until it's at the level of a crisis. We are invited as individuals and as a community to explore how the conditions, in this context our American culture, allow for harm to go unaddressed and ignored, and work together to find ways to break free of it. But what does that accountability really look like? Accountability can look like apologizing, making amends if that's possible, and making commitment to turn the lens inward and change behavior. This means doing the hard work that needs to be done to recognize our own feelings, especially guilt and shame, sitting with uncomfortable feelings and allowing ourselves to experience them, understanding why harm has happened and asking ourselves whether we have truly behaved in a way that aligns with our values, and then making a plan to make different choices in the future. Accountability also means showing up to be in relationship and in community with others, and the choice to remain in relationship with one another even when there is conflict, because it is inevitable. This also takes practice to do well. Accountability is really hard work. Since we've all been socialized in punitive environments, we feel like if we do harm, we will be ostracized or punished or lose our community if we admit to doing something that hurts someone else. We equate harm with being bad, but we do not have to perpetuate a culture where we are defined by our mistakes. We have the choice to do things differently and to explore what it really means to be in community with one another and to repair harm in solidarity with one another. So, in reflection, my final question is this: how do we love ourselves and our neighbors and our enemies enough to be able to do that hard work of accountability?